10. One steel connection was built to hold half its load. Nobody checked the math before it went up. The federal investigation later confirmed it. The connection carried barely 50% of the weight it needed to. That is not an opinion, that is an engineering finding. 28. Here is the bet. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how one quiet drawing change made for convenience, not malice, became the deadliest structural failure in American history until September 11th. And you will see the price tag behind it, over $140 million in settlements, 2 engineering careers erased overnight, and a company that stopped existing within a decade. Stick around, because the fix that came out of this disaster is now a legal requirement on every construction site in the country, and almost nobody watching this knows what it actually is. Asterisk brand card asterisk. Welcome to the money current. The hotel that wanted to be a stage, 35-30. In 1980, the Hyatt Regency Kansas City opened as one of the most talked about buildings in the region. Its centerpiece was a soaring atrium lobby, 4 stories of open air, glass, and light, the kind of architecture built specifically to be photographed. Suspended across that open space, on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors, were a set of walkways, sky bridges connecting one side of the hotel to the other. Guests could stand on them and look straight down into the lobby below. They were not just hallways, they were the visual signature of the entire building. That design choice mattered because it meant these walkways were built to be occupied, not just crossed quickly, but stood on, gathered on, photographed from. On any given evening, dozens of people might be leaning on those railings at once. The hotel became a hub for exactly the kind of events that fill an atrium with people. And on July 17th, 1981, less than a year after opening, the hotel hosted a tea dance, a weekly social gathering that had quickly become one of the most popular events in Kansas City. That night, an estimated 1,600 people packed into the lobby and the walkways above it. Nobody in that crowd had any reason to think about steel rods or connection plates. That was, by design, invisible to them. It was supposed to be invisible to everyone. That is the whole point of structural engineering done correctly. The problem is what happens when it is not done correctly, and nobody notices until it is far too late. Atrium hotels like this one were, at the time, a genuine architectural trend across the country. Developers had figured out that a dramatic open lobby photographed well, sold rooms, and made a building feel like a destination rather than just a place to sleep. Suspended walkways were part of that same instinct. They let architects turn structural necessity into spectacle, a place guests would actually want to stand. That same instinct is exactly what makes this story worth understanding financially, not just structurally. The feature that made the building famous and profitable was, quietly, also the single point where an unchecked cost-saving decision could do the most damage. A design that actually worked too. 30. The original engineering concept for these walkways was sound, and it is worth understanding exactly why, because the story only makes sense once you see what got thrown away. The initial plan called for a single continuous steel rod running from the roof, down through the 4th floor walkway, and continuing down through the 2nd floor walkway below it. Each walkway would hang from its own dedicated hanger connection on that one continuous rod, meaning each walkway supported only its own weight, independently. Think of it like 2 separate hammocks tied to the same tree, but each with its own rope running all the way up. If one hammock is under strain, it does not transfer that strain to the other. Each connection point only ever has to bear one walkway's worth of people. That was the design that got approved. It was reviewed, it was sound, and critically, it is not the design that was actually built. Somewhere between the drawing board and the construction site, an entirely different structure went up in its place. And almost nobody outside a small group of people realized the difference mattered until it was too late. Structural engineers describe this kind of independent load design as clean for a reason. Every connection point in the system only ever has to answer one question: can it hold the weight directly assigned to it? There is no hidden multiplier, no scenario where one part of the structure quietly inherits a second walkway's worth of people without anyone accounting for it on paper. That clarity is what a load calculation is actually for. It turns We think this should hold into a number that either clears the required margin or does not. The change nobody signed off on, 4:37:00. Here is where the financial and professional story really begins, because this chapter is not really about steel. It is about communication, liability, and who is accountable when a drawing changes hands. The original single rod design was difficult and expensive to fabricate. Running one continuous threaded rod through both walkway levels meant the entire rod needed threading along its full length, and the fourth floor walkway would have had to be threaded onto the rod during construction, a genuinely awkward, costly process for the steel fabricator. So the fabricator proposed a change. Instead of one continuous rod, use two separate shorter rods. One would run from the roof down to the fourth floor walkway. A second, separate rod would run from the fourth floor walkway down to the second floor walkway. Structurally, this sounds like a minor adjustment. It was not. Under the new design, the fourth floor walkway's connection point was no longer just holding its own weight. It was now holding the weight of the fourth floor walkway and transferring the full weight of the second floor walkway through that same connection. One box beam connection was now doing the structural job that two independent connections used to share. The load on that single connection had effectively doubled. This change was drawn up by the fabricator and submitted as a shop drawing, the kind of routine paperwork that passes between contractors and engineers constantly during construction. The engineer of record's firm stamped it. To this day, exactly how carefully that drawing was reviewed, and by whom, remains one of the most disputed and studied questions in American engineering liability history. What is not disputed is this: nobody ran the load calculations on the new connection design before it was approved and built. It went from a shop drawing straight to steel. At the time, this kind of stamp was often treated, in practice, as a formality, a confirmation that the drawing was consistent with the general design intent, not a promise that every load path had been independently re-verified. That gap between what a stamp legally implied and what people in the field assumed it meant is, in large part, what the entire rest of this story turns on. It is also, financially, the cheapest possible failure point. The review that would have caught this cost almost nothing compared to what skipping it eventually cost. The warning that got explained away, 7:008:30, 2 years before the collapse in October of 1979, while the hotel was still under construction, a section of one of the atrium walkways collapsed. Nobody was on it at the time, nobody was killed, an investigation followed. The cause identified at the time was traced to a connection failure between the walkway structure and the atrium roof. A real, documented structural problem, not a rumor. The findings from that 1979 collapse did not prompt a fresh, independent review of the load-bearing capacity of the walkway connections that would ultimately fail 2 years later. The project moved forward. The hotel opened on schedule, and the underlying vulnerability in that fourth-floor connection, now carrying double the load it was ever designed for, remained in place, invisible, holding up hundreds of people every single day the hotel was open. From a risk management standpoint, this is the single most expensive missed opportunity in the entire timeline. A partial collapse during construction is, in effect, a free stress test. The structure is telling you something, before anyone's life depends on the answer. The investigation that followed the 1979 incident looked narrowly at what went wrong on site that specific day, rather than stepping back and asking whether the connections holding up the finished walkways could actually carry the load they were now being asked to carry. That narrower question got answered. The broader, more expensive question never got asked at all, and it was the only one that would have mattered 2 years later. The night of July 17th, 8:30:10:30. By the summer of 1981, the Hyatt Regency's Friday tea dances had become one of the most popular recurring social events in Kansas City. On July 17th, the lobby and the suspended walkways above it were filled with people dancing, watching from above, moving between floors. At around 7 o'clock in the evening, without warning, the connection joining the fourth-floor walkway to its support rods failed. The fourth-floor walkway fell onto the second-floor walkway directly beneath it. The combined weight of both structures then came down onto the crowded lobby floor below. 114 people were killed. More than 200 others were injured. It remains, to this day, one of the deadliest structural failures in United States history, and it held the record as the deadliest until the attacks of September 11, 2001. The response that followed from Kansas City firefighters, paramedics, and ordinary bystanders who stayed to help pull people from the wreckage was, by every account, extraordinary. But no rescue effort could undo what a single, unexamined shop drawing had already set in motion 2 years earlier. What the investigators found 10/30/12/30 in the aftermath, the National Bureau of Standards, the federal agency responsible for investigating major structural failures, conducted a full technical review of the collapse. Their findings became the definitive account of what happened, and they are still taught in engineering programs today. The investigation confirmed that the fourth-floor connection, as actually built, had a load capacity of roughly only 60% of what Kansas City's building code required, even under the original single-rod design. But once the design was changed to the two-rod box beam configuration, that same connection's effective capacity dropped to somewhere around 30% of code requirements. In practical terms, investigators found the connection was carrying roughly double the load it could safely support, using a design that had never been recalculated for that new load. The National Bureau of Standards team did not rely on theory alone. They reconstructed the connection in a laboratory, built physical models of both the original single-rod design and the box beam design that was actually used, and tested them under controlled loads. The results matched the math. The box beam connection failed at a fraction of the weight the original design would have handled without issue. It was, by the standards of structural forensics, about as clear-cut a finding as an investigation ever produces. No ambiguity about the cause, no competing theory that ever seriously challenged it. This was not a case of materials failing unpredictably or of an act of nature. It was a straightforward, calculable engineering failure, the kind that basic structural analysis would have caught, if anyone with the authority and responsibility to check it had actually run the numbers after the design changed. If a story like this is useful to you, subscribing means you catch the next cost of the mistake breakdown the day it goes up. The reckoning measured in dollars and licenses, 12/30/14/30. This is the part of the story that belongs on a finance channel because the consequences here were not just human. They were financial and professional, and they were severe. Civil lawsuits followed quickly, and settlements from the collapse eventually topped $140 million, an extraordinary sum for the early 1980s, and one of the largest liability payouts connected to a single building failure in American history at that time. The professional consequences were just as severe. Jack Gillum and Daniel Duncan, the two engineers of record most directly tied to the design and its approval, had every professional engineering license they held revoked, in every state where they were licensed. Their careers in the field they had trained for ended. The engineering firm behind the project, GCE International, lost its membership in the American Society of Civil Engineers. Its business did not survive the fallout. Criminal negligence charges were also brought against the firm and against Gillum himself. Those criminal charges were ultimately dropped, but the civil and professional penalties stood, and they were career-ending and company-ending. For a finance audience, the lesson sits right at the intersection of risk and accountability. An unreviewed shortcut, taken to save fabrication cost and time, generated liabilities worth vastly more than anything it saved, multiplied out across a settlement bill in the hundreds of millions and 2 ruined careers. The math of cutting corners rarely works out the way it looks like it will in the moment. It is worth putting a number on exactly what was saved versus what it cost. Splitting the rod into 2 shorter, easier-to-fabricate pieces saved the steel contractor a modest amount of labor and material, a rounding error by any reasonable estimate against the overall project budget. Set that against $140 million in settlements, the total loss of a professional engineering firm, and 2 license revocations that ended careers outright. By almost any measure of return, it is one of the worst trades in the history of American construction. How this disaster rewrote the rules, 14/30/16/00. The Hyatt Regency walkway collapse did not just end careers, it changed how engineering is practiced in the United States. Before 1981, it was common for engineers of record to treat shop drawing review as a formality, a quick check rather than a full reanalysis. After the investigation's findings became public, that changed permanently. Engineering licensing boards and professional standards bodies moved to require documented, substantive review of any structural change made during fabrication, with the engineer of record required to demonstrate they actually verified the load calculations, not simply stamped the paperwork. Today, this case is a cornerstone of engineering ethics education across the country. Almost every civil and structural engineering student in the United States studies the Hyatt Regency collapse specifically as the textbook example of why a seemingly minor, cost-saving design change can never bypass a full engineering review, no matter how routine it looks on paper. The financial logic of that rule is easy to miss, but it is the whole point of this channel. A documented, substantive re-review of a single connection, at the time, would have cost the project a few hours of an engineer's time, a rounding error against a multi-million-dollar hotel build. Skipping that review did not make the risk disappear. It just moved the cost downstream, hid it from the balance sheet, and let it compound quietly for 2 years until it came due all at once, in lives first, and then in the $140 million that followed. The real cost of a skipped calculation, 16,0017,00, strip away the steel and the architecture, and this story is fundamentally about a financial decision disguised as a technical one. Somebody chose the cheaper, easier fabrication method. Nobody reran the math to confirm it was still safe, and the gap between what was assumed and what was actually true turned out to be catastrophic, measured first in human lives, and then, inevitably, in money. $140 million in settlements, 2 revoked licenses, 1 company that no longer exists. That is the pattern this channel keeps coming back to in markets, in companies, and in stories like this one. The cost of skipping verification is never zero. It is simply deferred, and it compounds, until someone is forced to pay the entire bill at once. Whether it is a fabricator skipping a load recalculation, a company skipping a risk review before a merger, or an investor skipping the fine print before putting money into something that looks fine on the surface, the shape of the mistake is the same. The verification step always looks skippable in the moment, because most of the time, nothing visibly goes wrong when you skip it. The Hyatt Regency walkway stood, fully occupied, for 2 full years before anyone paid the bill on that missing step. That is exactly what makes this kind of risk so dangerous, and exactly why it is worth understanding in detail instead of learning it the expensive way. Want more stories like this? The moment a small decision became a massive bill, subscribe to the Money Current.